it's been 105 days since you were last able to come to Transit and Inside Out here at Athens Church. 105 days. That's almost 29% of the year 2020 that you had to be stuck in quarantine. And 105 days is a long time, and it's actually given you a lot of time to get pretty good at some things, right? Like, you've gotten pretty good at day sleeping, sleeping between the hours of 4 a.m. and 2 p.m., right? You've got really good at Zoom. You've got really good at getting tan. You've got really good at getting physically fit or being physically active. There's some things about quarantine, about the past 105 days that have been pretty awesome. If I would have told you at the beginning of the year that school was going to be canceled, that your summer break was essentially going to start in March, and that you were going to be able to sleep in until whenever you wanted and your parents didn't care at all, you probably would have said, sign me up. That sounds awesome, right? But there were some things about the past 105 days that weren't so great, wasn't there? There were some things in your life that maybe you weren't so good at, or things that didn't go quite as planned. You see, maybe there's that thing in your life, that struggle in your life, that sin that maybe you thought you had conquered, but in the past 105 days, it's actually crept back up, and you're struggling with it again. Perhaps you're not as disciplined as you thought you were. Or perhaps that relationship with your mom or your stepdad that you thought had been repaired is still really complicated and still really hard. Or maybe it's your faith with God. You thought your faith with God was really strong before the last 105 days hit, but you realize that not having this routine has been really hard for you in a relationship with God. You feel like God is distant and far. Well, luckily, there's a guy in the Bible named Paul who talks about a time where he's been struggling with some things, a time where he's going through something we're going to call weaknesses. You see, Paul is an amazing guy in the Bible. He actually at first hated Christians. He actually persecuted and put Christians to death. But one day, he was on a road and he encountered Jesus. And from that day forward, Paul's life was changed. And he became a key player in the message of Jesus spreading around the world. And Paul spent a lot of time in isolation, right? Paul spent a lot of time by himself. You see, he was shipwrecked on an island one time. He was thrown in jail. A lot of the letters that we see from him in the Bible are actually from him writing in jail to others. So he had a lot of time in isolation. And through that isolation, he saw some things creep up in his life that weren't good, that were really hard. And so we're going to pick it up in a letter that Paul writes to a church in a place called Corinth. And he's writing to the church that's struggling. Here's what he says. He says, "But he said to me, God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." You see, Paul saw these weaknesses as opportunities for God to do something in his life. By God's grace, we're able to endure those really hard things in life. So instead of running away from them, Paul actually invites God into them, invites the strength of God, the grace of God into those hardships and weaknesses to allow God to do his work. You see, you weren't meant to do life alone. You weren't meant to do life independent from God. And during the last 105 days, you've had a lot of independence that you maybe haven't had before. And so my challenge to you today is to lean on to God when you go in those weaknesses. And see, you might think that the past 105 days for me have been, easy, And but I want to say that they weren't actually. At the beginning of the quarantine, I was actually really excited about trying some new things. And I was excited about new opportunities that came about. But I realized that I actually really like routine. I really liked having my day planned out. I really liked having my week planned out. And when quarantine hit, that sort of all changed. Each day looked different. And I realized I was starting to get irritable. I was starting to disconnect from God. And before I realized it, I had to know that I was struggling with it. And so in some time alone with God, in sharing with some friends, I found out this idea that I want to share with you today. Before you can grow, you got to know. You see, God knows you better than you even know yourself. He knows your struggles. He knows your weakness. He knows the hardships that you're walking through. But until you come to recognize them, before you take those ideas, take those things that you're going through and address them as weaknesses and ask God to enter into them, it's going to be really hard for you to grow. And so I challenge you just right now to to think about those weaknesses, think about those areas in your life that have crept up in the past little while. And I want you to take those things to God and ask for God, by His grace, to enter into that conversation, to enter into that area of your life. And then by His grace, you'll see that He can use your weaknesses as a strength.